I love this. So, most of the time, real heroes aren't even aware that they're heroes. They just do what they do because it comes naturally. It's something that's intrinsic. And we've been seeing an awful lot of heroes these days. Somebody shout out some examples of heroes that you might have noticed recently.
Firefighters.
Firefighters, yes. What? Who else? Say it again. Policemen, yes. How about neighbors? There have been some neighbors doing some pretty heroic things. Nurses, doctors. Yes, Rose?
The 911 operators.
911 operators, yes. Yes. People who, because we need them so much, who never quarantined, like cashiers, CNAs, people who are custodians and who oftentimes are paid the least, but if they didn't show up, what would happen to our society? I'm thankful for those heroes showing up.
Ordinary people who just do ordinary things.
Ordinary people who just do the right thing, the ordinary right thing. That's what we're going to talk about today, and that hero is going to be Boaz. And you may know this story, but we're going to revisit it. Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. But first I have a joke, because every good pastor has a joke oftentimes, don't they? A junior high teacher asked his students to make a list of who they thought were the 11 greatest living Americans. Toward the end of class, one student was still struggling to finish his list. The teacher asked him how close he was to finishing. The student said, I've got the other 10 figured out, but I'm having a tough time deciding on my fullback. So to him, his heroes were sports figures. And isn't it true that oftentimes we call sports figures and celebrities heroes? And we bestow that upon them, but oftentimes they're there because of their circumstance, which isn't often heroic. It might be that they have a talent. But sometimes we get our priorities mixed up about what is really heroic. So those upon which we bestow the word hero don't really fit the bill of heroes sometimes. So what are we to do? Where do we go to look for heroes? The hero we're going to look at today is often overlooked, but he was extraordinary. Boaz, throughout his life, I believe, can give a real definition to hero. So to look at the life of Boaz, you can't look at it without looking at Ruth and Naomi. And the setting for the story in the book of Ruth, and it's right after the book of Judges, in case you're looking. Sometimes I have to look in the table of contents. There is no shame in having to look at the front if you can't remember or you don't know where a book is, okay? So the setting is the story of Israel, sometime after the period of the Judges. And the Judges tell us that this was a time where, and I'm quoting from Judges, the people did what was right in their own eyes. Sound familiar? The people did what was right. They lived to please themselves, not God. Enter Naomi, an Israelite, and her daughter-in-law Ruth, a Moabite. Well, Moabites were pretty low on the totem pole, and it appears that Naomi's son had married Ruth. And when we first meet Naomi and Ruth, we learn that both of their husbands have died and left them as widows in Moab. There was almost nothing worse during this period of history than being a widow. Women were literally seen as possessions. So when you became a widow, nobody owned you. Therefore, nobody was responsible for you. You had no way to support yourself. feed yourself, house yourself, almost in poverty. But God's law provided a fix for that situation where the nearest relative of the dead husband should care for the widow. And there's a name for this, and I love it. It's called kinsman redeemer. Kinsman. Kinsman redeemer. So Naomi had no relatives in Moab, and she didn't know if any of her relatives were alive in Israel. And so at that point, Naomi takes a really selfless attitude. She decides she's going to go to Israel, and she encourages her two daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, to stay in Moab and start their lives over, even though this would mean dire circumstances for herself. She would even be more alone without her daughter-in-laws, but she was being very selfless. However, Orpah decided to stay. Ruth, however, refused to stay. And she said, I'm going. She would go with her beloved Naomi regardless of the consequences. And her heartfelt sentiments are in Ruth. And it's a verse that you hear all the time, especially at weddings. And it's chapter 1, verse 16. Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. She was pretty convinced she wasn't going to stay. Now that is a very famous passage. People put it on hearts that break into two necklaces, and they automatically think that it's a romantic familial connection, but it is a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. So off to Bethlehem they went with only the clothes on their back and God in their heart. And Naomi came to realize that a kinsman on her husband's side resided in Bethlehem. His name was Boaz, and he was a wealthy farmer. And it was the beginning of the barley harvest. And because she was a widow with no means of providing for herself, Ruth went to the fields to glean grain. In other words, to pick up the leftover grain from the ground that was left by the harvesters. I'm going to read Ruth 2, 11 and 12. But Boaz answered her after seeing her in the field gathering, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you shall have come for refuge. And he goes on to say, just glean here every day. And he told the gleaners to leave extra barley for them to get. He said, just be with my people right here. And if you need water, go over to the water and get yourself a drink. Do what you need to take care of yourself. So her problem with being fed was answered. And it is a known practice in gleaning that the outside and the corners of the crops were left for people to feed themselves who couldn't feed themselves. And so this was a very compassionate thing to do. When Ruth returned to Naomi at the end of the day and told her that Boaz had done so much for them, Naomi thanked God for his kindness. Ruth continued to glean in the safety of Boaz's field throughout the harvesting season. Because of Boaz's unselfishness, Naomi and Ruth's hopes for the future began to be restored. But Ruth wasn't secured. Naomi was concerned. Okay, this is a good fix, but how do I ensure that this young woman is taken care of for the rest of her life? This is great to have some barley, but what about a house? What about a husband? She's in a young woman who can birth children. So Naomi sent Ruth to the threshing floor where she knew she would find Boaz. That's where they all took their grain to have it processed. And as Boaz lay asleep, awaiting his turn at the thresher, Ruth came and laid at his feet. Now, I realize this seems really strange, but this act was not one of seduction, but one that was in accordance with the law. It was common for a servant to lie at the feet of his master and even share part of his covering. And by observing this custom, Ruth was saying to Boaz that, will you be my kinsman redeemer? Will you take me on as your responsibility? Find somebody to marry her. Make sure that she has a secure future. It was family business, nothing romantic. Boaz, being an unselfish man, had much to lose by honoring Ruth's requests, especially since their first child would be Naomi's heir, not his. Now, I had to do some research on this. The law guarantees that for a widow, in order to carry on the line of the deceased husband, the first child that she has after the deceased husband passes is considered an heir of Naomi and her son. Interesting. So he had much to lose. But Boaz focused on Ruth's virtuous qualities and was honored that she had come to him. This was remarkable in a culture that looked upon women, especially foreign women. Now don't forget, she was a Moabite. They were looked upon more as property than human beings. So his being compassionate to her was huge. There was one catch, however, to this pending marriage, and it meant marriage. As it turns out, there was one man in the city who was a closer relative to Naomi than Boaz. Ooh, that threw a wrench into this. It could be a show. This man had the first right to take Ruth as his wife, so if he chose not to, then Boaz could marry Ruth. And without hesitation, Boaz sought this man out and offered him the opportunity to act as a kinsman redeemer to Ruth. And that's in chapter 4, starting with verse 13 and 14. Wait, no, it's over in verse 7. And he says to the man, you get the first dibs. And in verse 6, he says, the next of kin, I cannot redeem it for myself without damaging my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one took off a sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the next of kin said to Boaz, acquire it for yourself, he took off his sandal. I saw that in a TV show this week and had not remembered that taking off that sandal was like signing a contract. So if you ever see that in a show, that's where it comes from. So Boaz gave this man an opportunity, and he didn't want it because it would take away the inheritance from his children. He was thinking of his family. He was thinking of his fortune. He was thinking of his stuff. And so he says, no, I'm not going to honor that kinsman redeemer. You go ahead. And there, before 10 witnesses, he declared that he would take her on. He would take Ruth on. He said to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilon and Mahlon. And I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are his witnesses. So he took her on so that the dead man's heirship could continue. Now, he married her. And it says in 4:13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." The women of then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." Notice the mother-in-law gets to say a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse, who became the father of David, and then down, the father of Jesus. Isn't that interesting how that lineage was carried on through the heroic acts of Boaz? They continued the lineage and assured that the Messiah would be secured. God often uses little decisions to carry out big plans. Boaz wasn't superhuman. He didn't have a publicist. He didn't have a contract with Nike. There was no promise of wealth or fame. Yet he is one of the best examples of a hero we find in the Bible. What about Samson? He was a military hero for sure, but his personal life was off track. What about David? You know, he killed Goliath. Once again, his personal choices left something to be desired. Boaz was honorable, honest, ordinary person who did something extraordinary for somebody else. And you know what? There are some things we can look at from Boaz that we can emulate. The first thing is that he did it without consideration. He did it without thinking. He did it as if it were instinctual. And the people that you listed earlier as heroes do it instinctually. And when you are honorable and have integrity, you will step out and do heroic things instinctually because of the God that lives in you and the Holy Spirit that dwells in you and empowers you. Heroes do the right thing at the right time. No hesitation in doing the right thing. Boaz was willing to sacrifice his wealth, his future, by becoming a kinsman redeemer for Ruth. Secondly, heroes innately put other people first. They don't think about what's in this for me. He was concerned about Ruth and Naomi's welfare. He understood about their social position. He had compassion. He helped them the best and only way, really, he could. So heroes want what's best for other people, and they put other people first. Maybe you've had parents that acted heroically on your behalf. Being a parent now, I'm aware of the times that my parents put me first. I remember the years my mom went without that new dress or new shoes so that I could have those awesome bell-bottom pants that were all the rage. Or those just right saddle Oxfords, or they had to be a certain brand. Or she wore that raggedy coat in winter to give me a new coat. Or my dad who worked dawn to dusk building houses so that we could pay off our bills and live with enough. The real heroes of the world aren't thinking about me. And oftentimes, it's just second nature. They are oftentimes unaware of their moments of heroism. And when it's brought up, they say it wasn't anything anybody else wouldn't do. It's simply their job. Not all puffed up, but humble and gracious. And I would venture to guess that Boaz didn't even realize fully the impact he had. He didn't realize the eternal significance because he wasn't alive to see that lineage of Christ come out as Messiah. His actions extended beyond his lifetime. And we spend our life putting deposits into things that are shallow and don't really matter, or into things that have eternal significance. Real heroes have their priorities straight. They know what's important and what's not. They don't sweat the small stuff. Can you imagine the talk that must have commenced about Boaz and Ruth? Do you think Boaz cared? Do you think he let it bother him? I don't get the impression that he did. Not in the least. He had his priorities straight. God was number one, and he was free. There is a freedom that comes from that. You could be free to act according to your principles because you realize that the only opinion that matters is that of Almighty God and nobody else's. This is freedom. Think about the people that you know that are heroes. They're all around us. I'm looking at some. Heroes unaware. They would never think of themselves that way, but they are, to your left and to your right. Sitting in cars to your left and to your right for those people outside. Maybe it's you. It could be you. There's a guy named Wendell Phillips who was an abolitionist in the 1800s during the era of the Civil War and after. And there's a story that he was sitting around a fire with a young man, telling stories, regaling him about stories earlier in his life of saving slaves and speaking on their behalf. And at last he realized that the evening was gone, and as he rose to leave, the young man took the old man's hand. He said, "Mr. Phillips, if I had lived in your time, I think I should have been a heroic person too." And this veteran abolitionist was aroused and replied, "Young man, you are living in my time and in God's time, and be sure of this, no one could have been heroic then who is not heroic now. Good night." So it is. We are living in heroic times, and the world is in desperate need of real heroes, and it's going to continue. So in compassion and love and the power of the Spirit, heroes go out and act from your instinct, from the Holy Spirit, on behalf of those who are in trouble, who need you, who need kinsmen redeemers in their lives. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, help us to see the power that is within us because of you.